Hello, everyone, and welcome to Claris Community Live. I'm Rosemary Tucci, Community Manager at Claris, and today it's my pleasure to welcome Charlie Bailey from fullcity, and he is going to talk about bulletproof integrations. So this is really a session aimed at how to get started thinking about integrating your FileMaker apps with public APIs. And as we get started, and as Charlie introduces himself, please do complete our welcome poll just to help Charlie know how much experience you have and to help me know what integrations you'd like to do a deeper dive on. Over the summer, I'm going to be planning a series of API integration deep dives. And so your feedback on what you're most interested in learning about will be helpful to me as I plan. So Charlie, take it
Cool.
away.
Let's get started. I'll share my screen. You got that?
Looks good.
Okay, super. So I am Charlie Bailey. I'm a technical lead at fullcity. Still have the codance.com domain for my email address, but we are technically and officially one company right now. And that just happened over this past year. Hi, Vlad, by the way. I'm getting a text message from Vlad. Good to see you. So yeah, we're going to be talking about integrating FileMaker with external services. This is going to be a crawl, walk, run type of presentation. We'll start with a really basic request. We'll talk a bit about authentication and move into a full-fledged production quality system that is available actually in a downloadable file that you can grab and integrate into your own solution. Let me select that screen. So why integrate? I mean, years ago when I first got started working with FileMaker, we used to do everything inside FileMaker. If we needed to integrate with email, we would build that in FileMaker. We'd be sending mail from FileMaker, receiving mail in a FileMaker solution, or tying it into some other system. It's largely with a copy-paste operation. But the big idea here is in today's modern world, we really want these specialized systems that we all use to do what they do best. And whether that is DocuSign or MailChimp or WordPress, those ecosystems do what they do and they do it very well. And there's no reason why we really need to reconstruct or build a system that does that thing. So we really like to let those specialized systems do what they do best and let FileMaker be the center hub of that larger universe. FileMaker is great at being that coordinator of multiple systems. In my day-to-day job, I'd say that integrations with external systems probably makes up at least 50% of the work that I do, probably a larger percent of it, probably closer to 70%. So how do we do that?
All right.
So,
Before you do that, let me
yeah.
read out the poll, and feel free to keep filling out the poll even as Charlie dives in. So the first question I asked is, how have you integrated your FileMaker apps with APIs? And this was a select everything that applies.
Yeah.
About 15–16% have done nothing, are brand new to the topic.
Mm-hmm.
About a third have used Claris Connect, Zapier, or another integration platform. About half are using insert from URL to services that are open, requiring no authentication.
Mm-hmm.
3/4 are using insert from URL to services requiring authentication. So I
Mm-hmm.
kind of split those two. And then a handful, about 13%, have used a commercial add-on or plugin, like one of the
Mm-hmm.
QuickBooks
Sure.
systems that are available to community members. And then for future community live episodes, those answers, like, it seems like the big winner is OData. And
Mm-hmm.
y'all will be happy to know I'm planning an OData session for May, so stay tuned for registration on that. And we have a few other, and I will take these other things into consideration as well.
Cool. Well, actually, thanks for interrupting, Rosemary, because I do have a tendency to get on autopilot and talk really fast. So feel free to interject as we go. Um, cool. I think that provides some good context, and I think that more or less syncs up with what we expected. Uh, so when we're communicating with external systems, just to provide a little bit of context for those that are relatively new to this, in the modern kind of internet universe, most applications, in fact, I'd say the vast majority of applications have some type of API or an application programming interface. And this is just an interface that is used to query the backend data through a set of business rules and allow one to retrieve results. Even the Claris FileMaker platform has APIs built in as well. So the OData API and the FileMaker Data API are two examples of API access to FileMaker systems. And the big question is, so are vendors building these things just for our benefit? And the answer is no. I mean, when the MailChimp front end is built, it's talking to the backend MailChimp API. So it's part and parcel of how these vendors have constructed these systems. And they're really just exposing their API or some portion of their API to us as developers to interact with the backend data. And the cool thing about that is that I don't need to know about the backend data. All I need to know is how to communicate with the API. And hopefully that doesn't change over time. If the backend database changes, very often the API will be adapted to accommodate those changes so that my requests to that backend data don't have to be changed. All right. What does a request look like? So when we're communicating with an API, we basically make a request and we get a response. And a request has a request can be very simple, like the one that's on the screen here, and they can be a little bit more complicated. But in its simplest form, we are hitting a particular URL, often thought of as often called an endpoint in this context. We're making a GET request in this case, and there are different types of requests, which we probably won't get into today. But that's just a URL, and in this case, we have some query parameters. So after the /weather, we've got this question mark, and we've got some name value pairs here. City equals Boston, units equal Fahrenheit. So I'm making a request at this endpoint. I'm including some data, and I'm expecting a response. So if things go well, we get a response. Very often, you're going to get something like a status of OK or some type of code that says things are good, and then you get some data back. And it's quite typical for these responses, as well as quite typical to send content in your request using JSON. So we're going to be looking at a bit of JSON today. We won't get into the details of how we're going to parse that, and certainly there have been community live events all about parsing JSON. You can certainly learn about that elsewhere.
Yep, and I will drop.
It's a conversation.
Yeah, and I will drop both of those JSON session links in the chat as you keep going.
Super. All right, so it's a request and it's a response. And when you're starting out, when things go right, you're going to get a JSON response. When you're beginning this process, you're likely going to get error codes. So getting to that first wonderful JSON response is the first hurdle in integrating with an external system. So when things do go wrong, you're going to get an error code. And then it's a matter of inspecting those error codes, trying to figure out what is wrong with your request based on the error codes that you're getting, and modifying your request so that you get a proper response. All right. So before we dig into this, there's always a big picture question that you should ask yourself. So we're going to get into some use cases in a moment, but if you're considering integrating your FileMaker system with an external system, I would highly recommend that you do a little Googling and searching to find out if something already exists. Maybe there is a Claris Connect flow that you can simply download and connect your FileMaker system to QuickBooks or connect your FileMaker system to DocuSign. Those types of things do exist, and they can very often get you up and running very, very quickly. And the wonderful thing about using Claris Connect, and to a lesser extent Make and Zapier and N8N, is that the authentication to that API is handled for you. So if you're using Claris Connect, for example, and you want to connect to DocuSign, there'll be an onboarding process where you're going to be entering your credentials, and Claris Connect will handle that that authentication to that external system for you. So that is just a little aside. It just is, it merits mentioning that you should really see if something already exists before you dive in and start building a custom integration.
Yeah, and I'll just add, if you have current FileMaker licensing, Claris Connect is included now. So you can just onboard directly following the instructions, and I'll dig up the help document for how to onboard, because I don't remember that URL off the top of my head. And I'll just also add one thing Ronnie always said when talking about using Claris Connect is if you're using one of the connectors baked into Claris Connect and the vendor of the API changes the API, you're absolved from it, because we will update the connector.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so you're not going to then be chasing down all your integration points in your FileMaker code to find that and make those updates.
It is a great point. APIs typically have a version. So you might be using version 2 of the MailChimp API, and then version 3 comes out, and they will support version 2 for a period of time, and do their very best to make, to make things backwards compatible so things don't break. But at some point, if you're doing a direct integration with a major API, you're going to need to rewrite it. That there will be a new version that comes out that is a breaking change, and the old APIs tend to live for a while, but then do get deprecated eventually. You'll generally get quite a bit of warning, but sometimes not. So it is a really good point, Rosemary. All right, so assuming we're going to build an integration to an external system, how are we going to do it? Well, it is the wonderful FileMaker script step, insert from URL with curl options. It's a relatively complicated script step. It requires quite a bit of configuration, or it can require quite a bit of configuration. But at its core, it's basically two things, right? We're going to specify a URL. So we need to specify, what is the URL that we are going to hit? And in this case, in this screenshot of this script, we're hitting the Google Maps API. And it's a complex endpoint, and there looks to be some query parameters here, which we're adding onto that URL. So very similar to the example that I showed a few slides back. And we specify a target, right? And the target can be a global field, a field in the local table, or frequently, and probably most often in the situations that I work on, that target will be a variable. So we're making a request to a URL. We're going to specify maybe some optional curl options, and we're going to specify that that response is going to go into a variable. And then we take that variable, we parse it, we first check to make sure that there's not been an error. And if there has, we need to handle that gracefully. But assuming we get some nice data back, we would do something with that. So it's a URL, a target, a response, and then do something. We're going to see that theme quite a bit. Okay, so let's look at a specific example. I looked around for a simple, unauthenticated, open source API, and I found this Open Medio API, which basically returns weather data. And just as a little aside, I've done entire talks on this, but when I'm approaching a particular problem, I like to write what's called a user story, and I've got one on the screen here. And a user story is really just a quick synopsis of who is the person that we are targeting for this feature or this application, what do they want to do, and why do they want to do that? So it's just the answer to those three questions: who, what, and why. So in this case is, I made this up. As the manager of the Massachusetts Beaches Lifeguard Association, I'd like to know the current weather forecast so I can be better prepared for our morning meeting. So let's integrate that into, so maybe this lifeguard association is using FileMaker to manage their staff. So let's build an open media integration to present to that manager some weather data prior to that morning meeting. All right, so let's switch over to our FileMaker application. And I don't want to do address validation. I want to do weather. Okay, so let's just kind of jump to the punchline here. I've got an address. This happens to be where I am right now, Manlius, New York, up in central New York, and I want to get current conditions. So I click this button, and I get current conditions. And overcast. Yep, I'd say it's overcast. And I know that it's about 70 degrees. I've got the windows open. It's a gorgeous day here in Manlius. So what happened there? I clicked this button and something happened behind the scenes. Well, we made a request to a URL. We got a response. We did something with that response, and we updated our interface. So what does that look like? So let's focus in on the weather scripts here. I ran this weather get current script. Okay, so here's the entire script. It's not particularly complex. Ignore this response not found. That's a plugin that I've got that's letting me know that I'm targeting a variable. I don't know why it does that. Targeting a variable I haven't defined yet, but it's totally okay. So I'm building the URL. So here is the URL. It's somewhat complicated, but it's a very, very simple, it's just a URL with some query parameters. So here is the Open Media API base URL. We're targeting version 1 of this. We're hitting the forecast endpoint, and the rest of this is just a bunch of query parameters. So we're putting in our latitude and our longitude. We're asking for the temperature at 2 meters above the ground. We're looking for the wind speed at 10 meters above the ground. We're looking for the weather code, and we're specifying what are the units that we want for this request. And then we call the API. Really simple here, right? I need to specify, if I click here, I need to specify a target. In this case, it is a variable, just $ response. I need to specify the URL. I'm just feeding in this variable, and that's it. We're just hitting this URL and getting a result. When we make that call to that URL, we pretty much immediately get a response that gets stored in our variable, our response variable, and then we're just the rest of this is just capturing bits from that response and doing something with them. We're putting the temperature into a temperature field, we're putting the wind speed into a wind speed field, and we're putting the conditions code into a conditions code field. And then that's it. We commit the request just to make sure that the interface refreshes, and we're good to go. So it's that simple. We can hit a slightly more complex URL and get a forecast, and that's basically the same thing. We just had different query parameters. We hit a different endpoint, different query parameters. We got a more complex result. And by the way, here's what this looks like. This is our response that we got back from the API. It's just JSON. It's nothing particularly complicated. Make sense? All right. Cool.
All right. And I don't know if you want to address this question, but I think Nick and Tobias, I will take your feedback back to the product team for their awareness and consideration. But the question is, what do you think about the fact that Claris's curl library is outdated compared to the version used by most other curl solutions?
Yeah, I don't know if I have an opinion on that. I've not run into to issues there, so I'd be very interested to hear about your specific experiences. But I agree, that's a question for the product team.
Yeah. And also, Tobias, I understand. I will take into consideration adding a level tag to these to these sessions going forward. And we have another actual question, and that is it advisable to use the JSON parse function when receiving the response from the API?
Yeah, so JSON parse, a wonderful function, can introduce some great performance gains if you're running into performance penalties. So it doesn't hurt to do it. If you're looking to eke every last bit of performance out of your solution, you should absolutely do that. I didn't do it here in this simple example. All right. So one quick aside. So actually, let me go back to my solution here. And do I have a link? Yeah, a link to Open Media. So how did I figure out what this endpoint was, right? How did I figure out what was the endpoint and what were the query parameters? Well, I went to openmedia.com and I went to the API docs, and everything I'm saying right here is not true because I didn't actually read the API documentation. In this day and age, with the availability of things like ChatGPT and Claude, these models are particularly good at poring over API documentation and giving you specific guidance as to, number one, how to authenticate to these APIs, but number two, what endpoints exist and how should you format your request to retrieve particular bits of data, and what kind of data are you going to get back. So I actually, in that example that I just showed you with that URL, I actually didn't construct that URL myself. Claude constructed that URL for me. I pasted it into the insert from URL script step, and I got the response. So it's just a quick aside to let you know that API documentation, yes, there are times when you're going to need to read it and pore over it, but more often than not these days, that is something that I leave to I leave these kinds of decisions and to Claude. Cool. So let's go back. All right, where were we? Yes, I don't read API docs anymore. Use AI to help you construct these queries and format your queries. Okay, so that is a very simple, unauthenticated request and response. And there's dozens, well, hundreds of open, unauthenticated APIs available. And that's great because they tend to be free or freemium. I know Open Media, if you start making 10,000 requests a day, they're going to ask for a little change, but it's free up until that point. Things can get more complicated though when authentication comes into the mix. One of the easiest things to do, and by the way, you don't have control over this. For an authenticated API, the way that you authenticate is going to be dictated by that API. One of the simplest methods that is in use is if you insert an API key in your URL. That's super easy. You can add a query parameter and insert your API key. Sometimes it's in the header. Sometimes it's a bearer token in the header. Sometimes you need to do things like OAuth and other types of more complex authentication, which can be quite tricky. At the end of the day, though, Claude or ChatGPT can be a great companion at solving some of these authentication difficulties.
So we did get a comment from Rob saying,
Yeah.
I've wasted so much time arguing with various AIs who are hallucinating functionality. For him, it's more trouble than it's worth. Yeah,
well, I think that's an opinion. It's not my. I have found great value with them, but I understand what you're saying, Rob. I sometimes do get in arguments with my AI companions as well. So I think it does drive. I think you do bring up a good point. It's important to understand the concepts here. It's important to understand how to direct your agent in those kinds of situations when it is making stuff up. And if need be, you can dig into the documentation yourself and solve those problems. But I would argue that it's far easier to do integrations right now where we are in this AI progression than it was, say, 5 years ago. Okay, so that's a simple weather lookup, and we're talking a little bit about authentication. So let's look at another example. This example, in most solutions that we build, we're dealing with addresses. It can be very handy to do things like zip code lookups or address validation. And let's take a look at an example that uses the Google Maps API, specifically the geocoding API, that allows us to ask questions about addresses. And here's my user story for our first example. As a data entry clerk, I want to just enter the zip code and have the system fill in city and state for me. This is one of my pet peeves. Whenever I'm filling in my address online, it drives me bonkers that they don't just ask for my zip code first. Type in your zip code, city and state are going to fill in automatically. So let's build a system that does that. So let's take a look. Can we do just that? So we're going to switch over to an address validation system. By the way, this file, you'll see later on, there's a URL at the end. This particular file is hosted on my GitHub, and so you can download it for free. So you'll be able to pick this apart. All right, so let's just create a new record here, and I'm going to fill in my zip code. 03, what is my zip code? 13104, 13104. All right. So I type that in, I tab to the next field, and Manlius, New York. So that happened in the blink of an eye. And I am talking not to a local table of zip codes. I made a request to Google's, to the Google Maps API, and said, hey, this is the zip code. Can you tell me the city and state? And in fact, we actually get more information back. We get latitude and longitude back. We get all sorts of other postal information back, but I'm just parsing and showing the Manlius, New York, the city and state in this case. So that's, so let's take a look at that request and how we built that. So let's take a look at the Google example. And again, it's a relatively simple, short script, but what are the components here? So at the top here, we do need an API key. So Google requires that you authenticate to all of their APIs. And there is a process there, which I will leave it to you to go explore. But again, Claude or ChatGPT can help you get onboarded. That's another wonderful thing about these AI models, is they can really help with that onboarding process. How do I get started with the Google Maps API is a great question to ask Claude. Thank you, Vince. We're executing a script here, this Google return API key. That's this script up here. And the only thing that does, I'm not going to show it because then I'll have to invalidate my API key. But that script, all it does is it returns a big long string of text, which is my API key, which I got by signing up as a Google developer and creating a project. I created an app. I stepped through that process and created an app, told it what API I wanted to access, and configured some of the scopes, like what did I want to be able to do with that API key with that particular API. And in this case, I said, I just want to do some basic address validation. So I'm going to get that API key, exit the script if there's no API key. When you download this file, it will not have the API key in it. So it will give you a nice error if that happens. And you'll need to put your own API key in that Google return API key script step. We're going to exit if there's no zip, just a little bit of very, very basic error trapping and error handling. And then we call the Google geocoding API with this particular endpoint. So what does this URL look like? Again, it's pretty straightforward, right? So here's this base URL. We're calling this particular endpoint the address endpoint. And we, it's this basic geocode JSON endpoint, and our first query parameter is the address itself, and we're just passing the zip code. Very, very simple. And we're saying that this is in the United States. We're making that assumption. And at the very end here is our authentication. So this is the most basic of authentication methods where we're including the API key as a parameter in our URL, a query parameter in our URL. We run the insert from URL. Again, we're putting that response into a variable, and then we're just doing something with this. We're parsing the response. We're getting the formatted address. We're just getting a bunch of stuff. We're capturing the city and the state, and then we put those into the city and state field. Very, very simple. And just as another example, we can do more sophisticated things like 303 North Street, which is where I happen to be right now. And I can validate that address. Similar type of request, slightly different endpoint, slightly different query parameters, but I'm typing in an address here and I get the validated address. In this case, I'm getting the zip +4, which is wonderful. I get the proper street address for my house, and it actually captured the city and state as well again. But here's our response. We get quite a bit of information here. We get locality, long name. So here's the county. Lots of information that comes back, and it's just then a matter of parsing that and then doing what we need to with our response. All right, so
Well, first, any questions from the audience? I don't see anything. So, oh, more comments about the level. I will
okay.
take that back.
Okay,
and
cool.
include it in my future descriptions.
All right, so let's talk about something a little bit more complicated. So here's actually an example that I encountered in my job at formerly Codance, now at fullcity, about 4 or 5 years ago. And I was working with a customer in Connecticut who runs a mobile catering business. And it's a small operation. They've got about 30 or 40 employees, a bunch of trucks that they drive around in. Long story short, what my customer said is he was using Adobe Sign for contracting at the time, and he had a custom FileMaker solution, and he was producing his contracts and his estimates and his agreements inside of FileMaker using a FileMaker layout. We've all done this before. Go into FileMaker, enter some data. We've got a layout with all the legalese, and things get merged into that. He was saving that as PDF, uploading it to Adobe Sign, filling out the fields, filling out the emails, sending the contract out, and then waiting for the response to come in. And that took time. And what he found is that even with that manual process, what he found is if he could get a quote and contract in front of an inquiring customer as quickly as possible, he found that he drastically improved his conversion rate. And so he was constantly getting emails from his website. So there was a form on the website where they were filling out that got emailed to him. As soon as he got that email, he was dropping everything that he was doing and going into FileMaker, creating this contract. And it just took time. And he couldn't always do that. You know, if he was out and just had his phone, that was tricky to do. So we looked at building an integration with Adobe Sign. And this was his manual process, right? The email was arriving. He was actually copying the contents of that email. We've all gotten those emails when you fill out a web form, you get an email with name value pairs. He's copying that into a FileMaker field. We were parsing that, building a contract, printing to PDF, upload to Adobe Sign, sending it out for signature. He would wait. He'd send a reminder to the customer. He'd wait more. Eventually, he would get the signed contract. He would go back into FileMaker, log into Adobe Sign, download the contract, go back into FileMaker, paste it into the container field. It was a lot of steps. 3 applications, took way too much time, and his quality of life was just in the toilet, I guess. So it was ripe for automation. So we built him an Adobe Sign integration, and as part of that, we constructed an application which is actually available on Claris Marketplace. If I can find it, where is it? There it is. So this application is available on Claris Marketplace. you can download it and copy and paste this into your solution, or just use it as an example for something that you construct yourself. One of these days I'll make an add-on out of this, but I haven't done that yet. So the workflow is pretty straightforward. So I'm going to create a new record here. And what you see on the left is actually this kind of fake contract. There are some merge fields in here. I think this dollar figure is a merge field, and mark is a merge field. You know, that's coming from this very simple record. And you'll see these things in red, and these are tags that if we create a PDF out of this in FileMaker and upload that to Adobe Sign, Adobe Sign can interpret that and know that, hey, that's where the signer number 1 initials go. And down here is where we're asking for the signature. So that syntax is specific to Adobe Sign. But the point is, we can save this PDF, we can save this as a PDF, upload it to Adobe. If we can save it as a PDF, upload it to Adobe Sign, we have some chance of automating this process. So let's take a look at
one question.
Yeah, Rosemary.
Does this require your client to have a subscription to with Adobe for this service?
Yes, it does. So there are, like many services like this, you are required to have a subscription. So if you want to integrate with MailChimp, you're going to need a MailChimp subscription. If you want to integrate with Adobe Sign, you need an Adobe Sign subscription. Same thing with DocuSign. It does merit pointing out that oftentimes, sometimes these vendors will require you to upgrade to a different tier to get API access to their solution. And Adobe Acrobat Sign and DocuSign are two examples of that. So if you have an Adobe Sign contract, or excuse me, if you have an Adobe Sign account and you want to do an API integration, you'll need to talk with your salespeople there to figure out what tier of service you're going to need to get in order to have API access. So great question. And it's not necessarily inexpensive. It is a jump in price. And in this particular instance, this conversation with this customer, it was going to be a few $1,000s extra a year for the Adobe Sign upgraded contract. But we decided that was well worth the savings and the increased conversion rate that he was expecting.
Well, right. I would guess for him it was also you said his quality of life was terrible.
Quality of life.
So.
Yes, yeah. So constantly being inundated with these things, and we're offering him the opportunity to completely automate this process.
And one last question on this: does the contract recipient need an Adobe subscription?
No, nope. So the contract recipient, just like most of us have probably signed a DocuSign or an Adobe Sign or some other online signature platform document before. Sometimes you'll need to identify yourself via email, so you'll often need to do a round trip via email, but that is a free process. The signer of the contract is not required to have any type of paid account. But there is a validation process there I can only assume it's for legal purposes. We want to make sure it's the real this is actually Charlie Bailey, and I'm signing this using my email address, and that's tied to me. All right, so I'm just going to put in a Gmail address that I can check in a second. I'm going to use this local document for my contract. It's worth mentioning, this particular framework will also allow you to choose a remote document. So there are ways of putting document templates up on Adobe Sign and just sending merge information that gets merged into those documents. But we're going to use a local document in this case. And I'm just going to create the agreement. Boom. And things are happening. And if I click this refresh button down here, it's going to say out for signature. All right. So a bunch of stuff just happened there. We created a PDF of this particular layout here. We saved it out to disk in a temporary location. We began our communication with Adobe Sign, the Adobe Sign API. It's actually a three-step process that just happened here. The first is to upload that document to Adobe Sign. So we did that. What we got as a response was a success code. and a unique key that identifies that document, and that's this value right here. And then we made another communication to Adobe Sign, and we said, hey, that document that I just sent you, would you please send it to this recipient? I want to send it to Mark, and here's his email address. And then the last thing we did was we said, okay, everything good? What's the status of that document? And there's a little bit of delay there, but we got this out for signature. So that document goes through a number of different states. It's kind of a provisional document, and then it's waiting. It's I don't know. There were a bunch of different statuses, but we are now in the out for signature state. And if we pop over to my email, if we refresh this, there we go. Okay, so this is that Charlie Bailey, and I got this email. I'm going to review and sign. So I'm now acting as the recipient of this contract. This was emailed to me. And we can see the document. By the way, this is done with a free Adobe Sign account. So every contract that I send with this free developer account is going to have this watermark on it. So it's great that you can do that. You can experiment to your heart's content, and even get a fully functional solution up and running for your customer before you pull the trigger on the account. All right, so I'm gonna put my initials in here. Since I've done this before, it recognizes who I am, so it knows what my initials are. And I'm going to, oh, I don't know why that's initials. Click to sign. There we go. There we go. Don't know why that did that. But the point is, this was a FileMaker layout, just moments ago, right? We saved it to PDF, and right where we specified with those merge fields, those Acrobat merge fields, those Adobe merge fields, is where we're putting our initials and our signature. And I submit this, and I now got a confirmation email, and the sender of that contract got an email confirmation as well to let them know that the document had been signed. So let's hide that. We'll come back here, and if we refresh this, and this can be automated too, right? We can check the status of our documents that are out for signature with a server-side script, or you probably could do stuff with webhooks too. But we check the status, and we see that the document is signed, and I can preview this document, and here it is. Here's the signed document right in our FileMaker solution. So the entire process, which was this 8 or 11 step process for my customer, is basically, come here, fill out the form, click the upload, and then retrieve. So it's super easy.
Yeah, you just mentioned webhooks and got a quick question.
Yeah.
What is your favorite or best way to provide a webhook in FileMaker?
There's a bunch of different ways you do it. Auto FMS has webhook capability, so that's super easy way to get a webhook on your FileMaker server. I've done that. I will spin up webhooks in Claris Connect, and my other favorite is N8N. So if you can fire up an N8N instance, I happen to have a self-hosted one that I use for personal projects. It's super easy to spin up a webhook in N8N. So lots of options.
The other one is, and this is relatively new, you can also do it with OData on FileMaker server. And I don't know the mechanics of it, but that was something that came into FileMaker server with one of the updates in the last year.
Very cool. I did not know that. Cool, I'll have to check that out. All right, so that's that entire process. So what does it look like behind the scenes? What do we want to look at? Let's look at, what do we want to, okay, so.
Hold on, a couple more questions. One more question is, someone said, our organization uses DocuSign, and does that have the same kind of API integration?
It does. So DocuSign has an API integration. They happen to use a much more complex method of authentication, which I've not looked at in a few years, but it does involve, I forget the name of it, but it's when you you authorize the application to act on your behalf, and the name escapes me at the moment. As I get older, I forget these terms. But in any case, it's a slightly more complicated authentication mechanism, but the basic principles are the same. So if you've already got DocuSign, there's no reason to switch to Adobe Sign to get access to the API. I would integrate directly with DocuSign.
And I did
There are
notice that
also other
Codex
third-party.
also has a sample for DocuSign.
Yeah, I think we
on the
do.
Marketplace.
Yeah. So check out the Claris Marketplace. We have a DocuSign example file up there as well.
Yeah, and there's like one last question is if you're sending these contracts to people, does the person on the other end need to have a pen to sign these?
No, so it's interesting. If you are using a tablet or something with a touch screen, that dialog that came up on my screen where I could type in kind of my initials in that script looking font, that's one way of doing it. But yes, you can sign with your finger on a phone or a tablet, or even, I would assume, a touchscreen laptop. So it's not a requirement though. So one of the things that these contract signing, these digital signature companies have done is they've certainly got their army of lawyers kind of figuring out, how do we validate who this person is? There is information that is gathered about when you signed that. There's information gathered about, what was the IP address that you that you were at when you signed it, and what is the email address associated with the account. So you don't have to sign with a pen. All right. So yes, this is a more complicated scenario, but let's just take a look at what is happening behind the scenes, just to ground ourselves in the idea that, yeah, all we're doing is we're hitting a URL endpoint with a particular, URL and some query parameters and maybe some additional stuff in the headers. And we're getting a response and we're doing something with it. It's that 3-step pattern that we're seeing over and over again. Make a request, get a response, and do something with it. In this case, we've got some separation here, and it is probably worth mentioning. This is just a design pattern that I've adopted over the years, where when I'm building an integration, I have a number of what I call private scripts, which these are all probably better be called context independent scripts. And these scripts in this folder accept a parameter, they do something in terms of communicating with the API, and they return the response. And that allows me to wire up kind of more UI scripts, these example scripts up at the top here, that kind of push all that heavy lifting into the background, where I am performing a script here which just says, hey, get the agreement status. Here's the agreement ID from the local record that I happen to be on, and capture the result of that. So we'll look at that in just a second, but that's where all the heavy lifting is happening. That's where all the communication with the API is happening, where the authentication is happening. And we're just saying, hey, give me the agreement status. Cool, here it is. That script says, here it is. And I do something with that. I get the status. I put the status into a field in FileMaker. I commit the request, and I'm basically done. This little bit down here just says, hey, if that status happens to be signed, then we should retrieve the document from the Adobe Sign API. Then I'm going to run this script, get agreement document, right? Here's the agreement ID, and I get the result. Now I can parse that result. I'm going to say here it says what we get back is a base64 encoded document. So we don't get the raw PDF. We get base64, which is just a text encoding of that binary document. And then we just need to decode that when we put it into the container field. I commit the records. And that was that step we saw. When we checked the status of that contract and it came back as signed, we ran this little subscript to retrieve that document and drop it into the local container field. So what's happening behind the scenes? Get agreement status. Again, this is that private script. This is the thing that accepts a parameter, right? It parses out the agreement ID from that parameter. It performs the script. We've seen something like this before, right? Get token and base URL. We know what that's going to do. That's going to give us the token that we need. That's a script in here where our secret token is embedded. It's going to get that token and the base URL, and that's going to allow us to construct our URL. It's going to allow us to construct, in this case, we do have curl options. This is where things can get a little bit more complex, but these are just headers. It's just additional information that we are supplying along with our request. In this case, this is where that token is. This happens to be a bearer token type of paradigm. And this is where that long string of random looking characters go. We create that URL, we do our insert from URL, and then down here, lazy programmer, this is where we do our error handling, and you can see I don't have any. If you implement this yourself, I would suggest you actually do a little error handling there because errors do happen. And we just pass back to the calling script the result. So when we did this update agreement status, that's what happened when we performed that subscript. So, you know, this is a way more complicated example than what we started with kind of polling and getting weather information or doing a zip code lookup, but the paradigm is the same. It's a URL, some kind of query parameters, in this case, some headers that we've set as well. We've assembled those into an insert from URL script step. We get a response and we do something with it. That's what we're doing.
And when you do that, I'm just going to say we have 10 minutes left. So more questions, please drop them in chat. And also, if you could complete our poll before you leave, just to let us know if we helped and what you're inspired to do next.
I just saw a question pop up on the screen, which I think is worth mentioning. The question is, how are we treating the token? How are we securing the token? It's a super good question, because that token, if that gets out, you know, a nefarious party could use your token to impersonate you, could use your token to make calls to the API on your behalf. So it is important to secure that token. And there's a number of different strategies. At the very least, I have a tendency to at least put that into a script, and that's what I've done in these examples. It's kind of some very base level security. Put it into a script, make that script execute with admin privileges. That way, only folks that have full access in your solution will be able to get to that script and look at that token. Sometimes we'll take that token and store it in a custom function. So create a custom function that the only thing that it does is return the token. That's another way to secure that token. And both of those kind of leverage the same principle, and that is, if you've got full access to the solution, you have access to the token. If you don't have full access to the solution, you don't have access to the token. So that's certainly one way of securing that token. And that's pretty much the way I do it. Put it into a script running with full access, or drop it into a custom function. I can probably skip over this. We talked about how where we've got these UI scripts and private scripts, and this really is not directly related to external integrations. It's just a design pattern that I have adopted over the years, just to be able to build what I call private scripts, or scripts which are context independent and can be called from anywhere in the solution. And the benefit of that is that these scripts can be executed anywhere. They don't depend on a layout. You don't have to spawn some kind of phantom window or go to a layout, which can introduce flashing in your interface when you're running these scripts. That's just a design pattern that I have adopted. And here's the private script where we're preparing the URL, we assemble the request, we make the request, and we return the result. This is it, right? It is always the same pattern when we're interacting with APIs. It is assemble a request, get a response, parse that response, and present that response to your users. So assembling that request, like I said, Getting the syntax correct for that request can be tricky. Your AI agents are your pal in situations like that. They can be very, very helpful in debugging problems with your request. And then if you are getting a valid response, that's great. Then it's just a matter of parsing that, usually JSON, that JSON response, and then doing something with that response. Setting fields, showing something to your user, navigating, do whatever your solution needs to do.
Yeah, we do have one question specifically about parsing JSON back where you get quite a few records. So, if you're getting hundreds of records back in your
Sure.
JSON,
Yeah. So
techniques to parse.
yeah, so when sometimes, depending on the use case, you can get, like with our address queries and our open media queries, we're getting a relatively simple JSON object. But even in those objects, were arrays. So specifically, when we were getting the weekly forecast from open media, we got an array of values. So parsing arrays, there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but the simplest way to do it is to loop through that array. So set these JSON arrays are zero-based indices. Set a variable. It's usually, for me, it's called index or I. We set it to 0. We target that 0th element, the first element in that array. We grab the JSON object out of that array, do something with it, increment our variable, we go up to 1, and we target that second element in the array. So loops are a great way of doing that. You can use while functions, but loops are probably the simplest and easiest place to start there.
Yeah, and I'm thinking
and paging can be an issue there too. So that's another complexity. Sometimes when you are asking for lots of records, you'll get, say, the first 100 records, and then you'll have to make another request to get the next 100 records. So those are complexities that makes our lives a little bit trickier, but it's really just a matter of looping through those pages, making multiple requests.
Yeah, and I think there were some, I don't remember if it was DEF CON or Engage sessions that did cover some of that more advanced JSON array handling. And I will dig those up and add them to the resources post I make in the community later today. Also with the caveat that some things have changed with JSON in FileMaker 2025. So there are some things that are more efficient now than they were 4 or 5 years ago.
Yes. Oh, I see a request for an OAuth 2.0. I would love it.
Yeah.
That one's tricky. Yeah.
I will add that to my backlog. And I just did drop in chat the registration link for April 30th. And that will be another kind of intermediate level where you can apply the basic principles Charlie shared today to email APIs. So we're specifically, I'm going to have 2 guests, and we're going to talk in depth about some of the most popular and common email APIs, which will enable you to do things like get delivery confirmations, send HTML email, and extend the email functionality of your FileMaker apps.
Super.
Yeah. So any other questions? Lots of thank you.
It's 59 past the hour. I think we've done well.
Yes. And I just want to say, lots of people are inspired to use address lookups, integrate signing. I think, Charlie, your example there hit home well.
Yeah, I will say that customer did see an uptick in their conversion rate. I don't think he did hard numbers, but it was on the order of 50 to 60% increase in his conversion rate for inbound inquiries, just because he was able to get back to the customer within minutes, even from his phone, at a baseball game. He was returning contracts.
Wow. And there's one last question about how do you handle error codes?
Yeah, so I mean, I think you could do an entire session on error handling. I always like to say error trapping is easy, right? Set error capture on, at least with FileMaker. But how do you handle errors? So usually with an API response, if you're going to handle errors, you're going to get a success code, yay or nay, right? And so the first thing you want to do is do something with those nay responses. If you get a success is not okay, and do something. So, and that's going to depend on what you want to present to the user. It's like, sorry, that didn't work. Contact the developer. Well, that's one way of doing it. But as you start to see patterns and you see typical kinds of failures, you're going to get specific error codes, and you may have ways of recovering from them. So it's about getting creative. If you get this specific error code and maybe it's just some kind of timeout, maybe you just need to try again. Give the user a button to try again, or whatever is appropriate for the error that you're getting. So the short answer is do something. The long answer is it depends on the situation.
The specific question was about HTTP error codes.
Yeah, send those to Claude. That's what you do. Copy the request, send it to Claude, and say, I'm getting this particular error code. What do I do? And Claude's going to come back and say, yeah, you've got an extra comma. It'll find those kinds of errors very, very quickly.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thanks for everyone who is still with us. Thanks, Charlie, for joining me today. And I will see
My pleasure.
everyone, I hope, in 2 weeks for email integrations. Take care.